On the 9th of July 2024, a woman opened her front door to a young man she had welcomed into her home for 18 months. He was carrying a bag of her daughter's belongings and a card addressed to her and her husband. She had every reason to think this was simply an awkward, ordinary goodbye. She had no idea that he had spent 11 days planning what would happen next, or that he was carrying a knife hidden in his backpack. What took place inside that house over the following 4 hours would end with 3 members of one family dead, a nation questioning how well anyone can really know the person their child brings home, and a set of laws about to be rewritten because of what one man did with a crossbow he had legally purchased online. This is the story of Carol Hunt, not just how she died, but who she was before a single knock on the door changed everything. Unreal True Crime launches its new book, Unreal True Crime Latin Edition. 35 shocking true murder cases from across Latin America. Buy it now on Amazon. Carol Hunt was born around 1962 or 1963. Very little is publicly known about her earliest years. No confirmed birthplace, no record of her parents or her maiden name. No detail about the school she attended. What is known is that she built friendships that lasted a lifetime. Carol belonged to a tight circle of 4 women: herself, Leah Holloway, Dion Smith, and Abigail Phillips, who stayed close from childhood all the way into their late 50s and early 60s. Leah would later describe Carol as a beautiful person, the kind of friend whose presence simply made a room better. Very few people outside that friend group ever got a detailed picture of what Carol's life looked like before marriage. No confirmed profession, no record of what she studied or where she worked in her 20s. That absence isn't an oversight in the reporting, it's simply who she was. Carol lived most of her life outside of public view, and there was never a reason for anyone to document her before the world had a reason to ask. It was Leah who was standing beside Carol on the day she first met a young man named John Hunt. At the time, and John was not yet a recognisable voice on British television. He was working as a Metropolitan Police officer in Kilburn, North London, doing a job that had nothing to do with the career that would eventually define him. Carol was the one who spotted an advertisement in the local Harrow Observer newspaper, a call for a trainee broadcaster to provide commentary for Ladbrokes in-shop racing service. She encouraged John to apply. Colleagues who knew him for decades afterward would say it was Carol who pushed him to chase that opportunity, to take the professional leap most people talk themselves out of. John took her advice. He started with greyhound commentary, then moved into horse racing and eventually built a career with BBC Radio 5 Live and Sky Sports Racing that would make him one of the most familiar voices in British racing. Decades later, one of his colleagues would still remember John proudly showing off photographs of his girls at a Christmas gathering, more than 20 years before any of this happened. Proof that his identity as a husband and father was never separate from the identity people knew him by professionally. Carol and John married in Harrow in 1991. Over the following years, they had 3 daughters. Amy arrived in 1993, Hannah in 1996, and Louise in 1999. The family settled in Bushey, a quiet town northwest of London, and built the kind of life that neighbours would later describe using almost identical words: private, gentle, close-knit. One neighbour called them the loveliest family on the street. Another remembered them as quiet people who mostly kept to themselves but were warm and kind whenever paths crossed. Inside that household, Carol appears to have struck a careful balance as a mother. She paid close attention to her daughters' lives without trying to control them. As the girls grew into adults, the family home didn't become a place they simply visited on holidays. It stayed the centre of their world. Louise eventually built her own dog grooming business out of an outbuilding on the property, working with local clients who brought their dogs to her door. Her school friends remembered her as upbeat, hard-working, and almost always smiling. Hannah trained as a skin and beauty therapist, earning a reputation with her clients as excellent at her job and easy to love. Amy, the eldest, remained close to both her parents and her sisters, and would later become her father's closest source of support. The family's social life outside the house was, by every description, ordinary in the best sense. Meals out together, pub lunches, birthday celebrations, and holidays that included trips to Italy and to Disneyland. None of it suggested a household chasing anything unusual. It suggested a family that simply liked being around each other, which is a rarer thing than people sometimes assume. By all accounts, this was a family that genuinely enjoyed being around one another. In a later interview, Amy would recall an evening when she and her sisters sat together and talked about how lucky they felt to have grown up the way they did. Supported, secure, never truly worried about anything that mattered. Hannah, in Amy's memory, had come home afterward and told her mother directly how grateful the three of them felt for the life their parents had built. That conversation, remembered only later, captures something simple about who Carol was to her daughters, someone they still wanted to run home and tell things to, even as fully grown women. Sometime around late 2022 or early 2023, Louise began a relationship with a 20-something former soldier named Kyle Clifford. He had served roughly 2 years in the British Army but had spent much of that time at home, citing illness, and had never seen active deployment. By the time he met Louise, he was out of the military and unemployed. For a while, the relationship looked ordinary from the outside. Clifford was invited into the rhythms of Hunt family life. Sunday lunches, birthday celebrations, and eventually a full family Christmas that stretched across several days, filled with food, games, and the kind of noise a happy household makes. John would later remember that Christmas fondly, recalling nothing that suggested the man sitting at their table was capable of what came next. But underneath the surface, something else was building. As the relationship went on, Louise began noticing patterns that troubled her. Arrogance, flashes of anger, comments she considered prejudiced and belittling. Carol, watching from the sidelines the way mothers do, reportedly picked up on Clifford's immaturity herself. But rather than stepping in and dictating what her adult daughter should do, she chose to trust Louise to work it out on her own terms. It was a quiet kind of parenting, present, watchful, but not controlling. By June 2024, Louise had made up her mind. On the 26th of that month, she ended the relationship. According to her family, she did it as gently and maturely as she could, not out of anger, but out of a clear-eyed decision that whatever good had once existed between them could no longer outweigh how the relationship made her feel. Clifford appeared to accept it at first. Then he didn't. He tried to win her back. Louise held her ground. What the Hunt family didn't know was that Clifford's inability to accept the breakup was about to turn into something calculated. Investigators would later reconstruct, almost to the day, an 11-day countdown that began shortly after the split. Clifford started researching John Hunt's work schedule and daily movements. He looked into Carol's presence on social media. He searched for and then purchased a compound crossbow, along with bolts and a rope-cocking device. He bought a 10-inch butcher's knife online. He picked up duct tape, rope, and 2 petrol containers. He even test-fired the crossbow into a tree to make sure it worked. Somewhere in that same window, he also bought a CO2 air pistol, though that particular item never arrived before everything else happened. He checked the weather forecast for the day he was planning. He wrote letters to his own family, and he prepared a story he could use to get through Carol Hunt's front door. On the 9th of July 2024, that story became real. At 2:32 in the afternoon, Clifford arrived at the Hunt family home carrying a bag of Louise's belongings and a card addressed to Carol and John, and a knife concealed inside a black backpack. Carol answered the door. Doorbell footage would later capture the exchange. She spoke to him kindly, the way she apparently spoke to almost everyone, and let him inside so he could return Louise's things. Within minutes, the timeline suggests somewhere between 6 and 13 minutes after his arrival, Clifford murdered Carol Hunt with the knife he had bought for exactly that purpose. He did not leave. Instead, sometime around 3:10 p.m, he went back out to his car and retrieved the crossbow, hidden under a white covering, and brought it inside. He then waited. Louise was working in the garden outbuilding where she ran her grooming business, and Clifford knew her routine well enough to know she would eventually come into the main house. At 4:13 p.m, she did. What followed lasted more than 2.5 hours. Clifford restrained Louise with duct tape and held her captive inside her own home. During that time, he went through her phone, checking her messages and her Instagram activity. Still, even in that moment, consumed by jealousy over her life without him. At one point, he searched online to find out whether disabling a smoke detector would trigger an alarm, evidence that he may have been weighing whether to set the house on fire. Just before 6 o'clock, he used Louise's own phone to message her father, John, asking when he'd be home, a calculated move to make sure John stayed away while everything played out. During her captivity, Clifford raped Louise. Then, before 6:50 p.m, he killed her. At 6:51 p.m, Hannah Hunt came home. She had no idea what she was walking into. Within a minute of arriving, she managed to send an urgent message to her boyfriend, Alex Klein, asking him to call the police immediately, telling him Clifford was there and that people were being tied up. It was the fastest, clearest signal anyone outside that house would get. At 6:54 p.m, Clifford shot her. A minute later, he left the property. Even after being shot, Hannah did not go down without doing everything she possibly could. She made her way through the house, found what had happened to her mother and her sister, and picked up Carol's phone to call 999. She stayed on the line long enough to identify her attacker by name, tell the operator she had been shot, and give them the address. Police and paramedics reached the house at 7:10 p.m. Hannah was still alive when they arrived, though she could not be saved. By then, Clifford was gone. He drove toward Enfield, and a massive armed manhunt began almost immediately, with police publicly warning residents not to approach him because he was believed to be carrying a crossbow. He was eventually located hiding in undergrowth near Lavender Hill Cemetery, roughly 22 hours after he'd first knocked on Carol's door. As armed officers closed in, Clifford turned the crossbow on himself and fired, leaving him paralyzed. No police officer discharged a weapon. He was taken into custody and treated in hospital under police guard. Because of the severity of his injuries, Clifford wasn't fit to sit for a formal police interview until the 16th of September 2024, more than 2 months after the murders. In that interview, he reportedly described what he had done as atrocious and apologized. He was charged shortly afterward with 3 counts of murder, the rape of Louise Hunt, her false imprisonment, and 2 weapons offences tied to the knife and the crossbow. On the 22nd of January 2025, Clifford pleaded guilty to the 3 murders, the false imprisonment and the weapons charges. But he denied the rape, forcing a separate trial in March 2025. His defence argued that the forensic evidence could be explained by consensual contact from earlier in the relationship. Prosecutors brought in expert testimony that dismantled that explanation, tying the physical evidence directly to the timeline of Louise's captivity. The jury didn't need long. After roughly 45 minutes of deliberation, they returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Clifford refused to attend his own rape trial. He also refused to appear, in person or by video link, for his sentencing on the 11th of March, 2025. Judge Joel Benathan considered forcing a remote appearance, but ultimately decided the family's chance to speak directly about what they'd lost shouldn't be disrupted by a forced or chaotic broadcast. John and Amy Hunt gave victim impact statements in the courtroom, describing what they had lost and, in John's case, thanking Carol for being the wife and mother she had always been. The judge's conclusion was unambiguous. He found that Clifford had planned or at least seriously contemplated killing all 3 women, not just Louise and not Hannah, as some unlucky accident of bad timing. Every piece of preparation, from the cover story built specifically to get past Carol, to the knowledge of Louise's routine, to the message sent to keep John away, painted a picture of a man executing a plan against an entire family. Clifford received 3 separate whole-life orders, 1 for each murder, meaning he will never be eligible for release. He was also sentenced to 20 years for rape, 8 years for false imprisonment, and 1 year each for the 2 weapons charges, all running concurrently alongside sentences that already guarantee he dies in prison. Technical analysis. From an investigative standpoint, this case is a study in how thoroughly modern digital evidence can reconstruct a crime almost minute by minute. Online purchase histories tied Clifford directly to the crossbow, the bolts, the rope cocking device, the 10-inch knife, the duct tape, and the petrol containers, all bought in the 11 days after the breakup. A paper trail that made any argument of sudden, unplanned violence essentially impossible to sustain. The Hunt family's own doorbell camera became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, capturing both the audio of Carol's final conversation and the visual proof of how Clifford talked his way inside. Search history retrieved from his devices, checking the weather for that specific day, researching whether disabling a smoke detector would sound an alarm, looking into John's work schedule, filled in the psychological groundwork behind the physical preparation. Notably, the murder weapon used on Carol, the knife itself, was never recovered, yet prosecutors didn't need it in hand. The combination of purchase records, packaging evidence, and Clifford's own eventual guilty plea was more than enough to secure the conviction. And in the rape case specifically, it was forensic timing evidence, not a confession, that closed the gap, allowing experts to demonstrate that the physical findings lined up with the hours of Louise's captivity rather than with any earlier consensual encounter Clifford's defense tried to point to. The reconstructed timeline itself is worth pausing on, because it's rare for investigators to be able to lay out a crime almost to the minute the way they did here. 2:32 for his arrival, roughly 2:39 to 2:45 for Carol's murder, 3:10 for the moment he retrieved the crossbow from his car, 4:13 for Louise's return to the main house, 6:51 for Hannah's arrival, 6:54 for the shot that killed her, and 6:58 for the call that finally brought police to the address. That level of precision came from stitching together doorbell audio, phone records, message timestamps, and 999 call logs into a single continuous account. The kind of case where the digital footprint left behind by both the victims and the offender ends up telling almost the entire story before a single witness takes the stand. Psychological analysis. Psychologically, what stands out most about this case is the gap between rejection and reaction. Louise didn't discard Clifford cruelly or without explanation. By every account, she ended things as gently as she could, having simply decided the relationship no longer served her well-being. For Clifford, that rejection appears to have curdled into something far darker than heartbreak, an entitlement to control that outlasted the relationship itself. The court found that his hostility didn't stop at Louise. It extended to the family members he believed had supported her decision to leave, which is precisely why Carol and Hannah weren't incidental casualties, but, according to the judge, part of the plan from the start. Investigators also found that Clifford had searched for content connected to a well-known misogynistic online influencer less than 24 hours before the murders, evidence that never reached the rape jury, but which prosecutors raised during sentencing as context for the contempt the judge ultimately described in his ruling. None of this amounts to a clinical diagnosis. No public evaluation has identified a specific disorder behind his actions. What the evidence does show is a pattern increasingly recognized in domestic abuse research. Separation itself, not the relationship, is often the most dangerous moment, when a partner who felt entitled to control someone interprets that person's independence as the ultimate insult. There's also something worth noting in how ordinary Clifford managed to appear right up until the moment he wasn't. He sat at family Christmas dinners. He played games with people he was, within months, planning to kill. That capacity to compartmentalize, to be a pleasant guest at someone's table while quietly building toward violence against them, is one of the more unsettling threads running through this case. And it's a big part of why John and Amy have since pushed back against the idea that families should always be expected to see it coming. Recognizing arrogance or a bad temper in a boyfriend is one thing. Predicting a calculated triple murder from those same traits is an entirely different and far less reasonable expectation. One more thing. Here's the detail that might surprise you most. At the time Clifford bought that crossbow, there was almost no meaningful regulation stopping him. Unlike firearms, crossbows in the UK required no license, no background check, no registration, just an age restriction and a few limits on how they could be used. A weapon capable of killing 3 people with the same lethal efficiency as a gun was, legally, closer to a piece of sporting equipment than a controlled weapon. This case became the turning point. In March 2026, the British government's official review response directly cited the Bushey murders as the reason for proposing sweeping new controls, mandatory licensing for existing owners, suitability checks before purchase, an outright ban on future sales, a prohibition on broadhead arrows, and stricter age verification for anyone buying online. As of the time of this video, that legislation is still moving through consultation rather than fully in force, but it exists at all because of what happened inside one house in Bushey. Equally striking is what John and Amy Hunt chose to do with their grief. Rather than let Carol, Hannah and Louise be remembered only as names attached to a headline, they created the Hunt Family Fund, channeling support toward causes that help and inspire young women, turning the very independence Clifford tried to punish into something the family is now actively investing in for others. Racing events, including a renamed race at Cheltenham, have since raised significant money in the family's name, extending Carol, Hannah and Louise's legacy well beyond the courtroom. Amy in particular has pushed back hard against the crossbow killer label. The press attached to Clifford almost immediately, arguing that it makes him sound like some kind of unique monster rather than what the evidence actually shows, an ordinary-looking man who concealed extreme misogyny behind a normal exterior. She's used her platform since the trial to talk about violence against women more broadly, about how boys are raised to think about relationships, and about refusing to let the story become only about the person who caused the damage. It's a rare thing in true crime coverage. A family actively working to keep the narrative centred on who was lost, not just on who did the losing. Carol Hunt spent her whole life building things that lasted. Friendships that survived 40 years, a marriage that survived 3 decades, a family that daughters wanted to come home to. If this story moved you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and drop a comment letting us know what stayed with you most.